Sometimes, the world around you changes before you can even realize what is going on. It was one of those mornings when everything changed for me. I'm Jake Larson, a journalist living in the heart of the city. I'm 35, and I have what most people probably would call a good life, a stable career, decent apartment, and a routine that keeps me standing. Every morning, I lace up my running shoes and head out into my daily jog. I guess you could say that I'm a bit of a creature of habit. This park, near my apartment, has always been my haven where I clear my mind before plunging into the mayhem of work. I jog along the same route year in and year out, first the old library, then a shortcut on a side street lined by 2 or 3 beat-up shops, and then the park, which with its trees opens up to bring about a serenity that is pretty rare within the city. But that morning was different. The weather wasn't, and neither were the people. It was something else. Something subtle, yet unsettling. I was running for about 10 minutes when I saw the stairs, not inside the park, but outside, next to an old, boarded-up building that I have passed 100 times before. The more I looked, the stranger it felt, for I thought sure that I must have missed them in the past. The stairs were cracked and worn, as if they had been there for decades, but how hadn't I noticed them? I couldn't quite get away from the thought that they weren't supposed to be there. I slowed down, wiping my forehead off with the back of my hand, and looked at them a minute longer. The building they led up to looked well abandoned, broken windows, peeling paint, and just that general vibe something gets when it's forgotten by time. But the stairs, they were clean, almost too clean. Like someone had been walking on them a lot recently. I shrugged it off, thinking that was just a part of how the morning light hit them. Still, the thought stuck with me for the rest of my run. Later that day, when I got to work, I tried putting it out of my mind. My editor, Richard, was one of those kinds who breathed deadlines and chaos and actually seemed to relish on them. There was always another story to chase, another lead to follow, and today wasn't any different. I threw myself into work, going through my notes, prepping for my next piece. It was supposed to be a normal day. Then the little things started happening. First, my notebook wasn't where I left it. Positive I had laid it down beside my laptop when I came in, but now, it was on the other side of the room, half open on a chair. An odd feeling swept over me, but I was distracted, maybe moved without thinking. That was the explanation I gave myself. Then Sarah, one of my closer colleagues, swore we hadn't talked that morning. I could have sworn that we'd had a conversation about a potential new lead for an article clear as day. But she looked at me like I was making it up, even laughed it off. I didn't think much of it then. The rest of the day seemed off. Like I was out of step with everything around me. The most ordinary things began popping into my conscious mind. Colleagues I normally passed in the hallways and said hello to, didn't. Several of them didn't even seem to notice me. I chalked it all up to stress. We've all had those days where everything feels just a little off, right? But the whole walk home that night, the image of those stairs kept creeping into my mind. Why couldn't I shake this feeling that something had changed in the very moment that I had seen them? I was standing at the window that night, staring out over the city. Across from me, building lights flickered like fireflies, cars hummed softly beneath. Tonight, though, instead of my usual sense of calm, I felt watched. Something, as though lying just beyond my vision, was waiting. I went to bed that night, the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. By morning I had convinced myself it was all in my head. Routine, I told myself. Just stick to the routine. I decided to forget the entire incident and resumed my morning jogging the next day. But when I reached that old building, my legs slowed down of their own accord. The stairs were still there, standing silent as the day before, just as worn and mysterious. I stopped, standing there for what felt like minutes, staring at them. Something in them was attracting me, and for that, I had no explanation. It was as if the stairs were waiting for me. I looked around, and nobody was in view, just the usual morning calm. I knew it was a bad idea. It was one of those times when you feel something in the pit of your stomach. Yet, before I knew it, I had moved closer to the steps and laid my foot on the first. The stone was icy against my shoe, and there rose a strange, sharp chill up my leg. I climbed upwards, my breath growing more rapid with each step. By the time I reached the top, my heart was thudding in my chest. There was a heavy wood door, slightly ajar, leading into what I could only assume was the empty building. My hand hovered over the doorknob. What harm could there be in taking a peek? I pushed the door open. The room inside was empty, just a dusty, forgotten space with cracked windows and shadows pooling in the corners. There was no furniture, there was no life to it at all. There was dust, silence, and that feeling of wrongness that overwhelmed me. It didn't belong here. None of this did. And then I saw it, a shadow moving, just out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Or at least, it looked empty. I slowly began to back away as my pulse quivered with fear. I needed to leave. Now. As I took the stairs, the world felt heavier, darker, like somehow I had just disturbed something I shouldn't have. I jogged back toward the park, trying to shake the sensation that something had followed me down those steps. The rest of the day was skewed. I knew, somewhere deep within my being, this was only just the start. Everything after that morning felt off. I did my best to convince myself it was all in my head, that none of it was real, the stairs, the shadow, that icky feeling someone was watching me. But something had shifted. I could feel it. And the worst part about it was that it was subtle, almost too damned subtle, but impossible to pin down, like trying to catch a glimpse of something moving just outside your peripheral vision. Things only got stranger the next day, after climbing up those stairs. I woke up like usual, made my coffee, and checked the news on my phone before heading out the door. Crisp morning air, jogging through the park, the whole 9 yards. It felt like I was operating on autopilot, trying my best to forget what happened. But even while I was trying to focus, the back of my mind kept straying back to those stairs. I hadn't even realized I was looking in their direction until I saw them again. They were exactly as it had been, worn, cracked and curiously, out of place. But this time around, I gave them a wide berth. Fat chance. I wasn't about to tempt the fates again. Still running, trying to clear my head, I might have sworn, as I ran past the stairs, to hear something feet, swift like someone was chasing after me. Spinning around, the street was vacant. Nothing. That should have been my warning, but I shrugged the feeling off and continued to jog. It wasn't until I made my way into the office things started to get weird. Sarah, the same girl who swore we hadn't talked the other day, sat at her desk scrolling through emails. I walked over, trying to play cool. "Hey, Sarah," I said, leaning against her desk. "We're still good for the editorial meeting at 3, right?" She gave me a puzzled expression. "Jake, we already had that meeting yesterday." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "The meeting's today." Her brow furrowed and she shook her head, chuckling a little nervously. "Are you messing with me? We had it yesterday morning. You even brought up that new lead about the missing persons cases." Now I was really thrown. No, I didn't. I mean, I don't even remember talking about that yesterday. We talked about it last week, but I haven't had time to follow up on it yet. Sarah looked at me for a second, her face changed from confusion to concern. "Jake, are you okay? You did sound quite fine in the meeting." I didn't know what to say. My heart did flips and for a second, the room spun around. What was going on? Why couldn't I remember that? Like there was this hole in my head, a gap my brain refused to bridge. But I couldn't freak out in front of Sarah either. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe I just need more coffee." Sarah did not look convinced, but she nodded and went back to her emails. I walked back to my desk, my mind spinning. How could I have forgotten an entire meeting? That is just not me, to just zone out or miss something important. More and more bizarre things happened that day. I asked my editor, Richard, about an article I turned in a week prior. He gave me a look, as if I was nuts. "Jake, you never turned that piece in. I've been hounding you about it all week." But I had. I remembered. Or, had I? I couldn't even rely on my memory anymore. At the time I finally got out of the office, I had never felt so paranoid. Was I flipping? Were these just gaps in my memory caused by stress? Or was something else happening? My mind just kept on zigzagging back to those stairs. I tried to tell myself it was all just a simple coincidence, but deep inside, I knew all that weird stuff that had been going on with me started when I climbed those stairs. Lying in bed that night, the day replayed itself over and over in my head. I wanted to pinpoint when, exactly, it all went wrong. The more I reflected on it, the more it wasn't just my memory that felt wrong, everything around me felt off, too. The apartment felt colder and darker, my phone buzzing with messages from people I didn't remember sending. It was as if the very city had a cadence, a different beat, an energy which was out of place. And then there were the shadows. I saw them out of the corner of my eye, quick, flickering movements just beyond my vision. I'd turn my head, and nothing was there. My heart would trip a beat, and I'd shake my head, telling myself I was just seeing things. But I wasn't. Not really. Something was there. I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. By the time the clock struck midnight, I couldn't have taken it anymore. I got out and walked over, casting my vision out of the window onto the street below. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel natural for such a big place. And as I scanned the sidewalk, my eyes were drawn once more to that stairway. Barely visible in the darkness, I knew they were there. And even from this distance, I could feel them calling to me. I hated it. I detested that pull they had over me, like some invisible force was drawing me back. The more I tried to ignore it, the more a chill began to run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I got back into bed, trying not to be afraid, but the fear remained in my heart, like a dark shadow that I couldn't shake off. The next morning, I decided to avoid the stairs altogether. I wasn't going to let them get to me again. But the instant I stepped out of my apartment into the street, I knew something was different. The city felt wrong. Off. The air was thicker, the colors muted. It was as if the world around me had shifted just enough to make me feel like I didn't belong in it anymore. I took a different route this time, sand stairs, but couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me as I ran. Waiting. It felt like every day more and more people at work looked at me strangely, like they knew something I didn't. Like they could see what was happening with me. And then, from nowhere, it came again, those footsteps behind me. I spun around in the hall, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there wasn't anybody. The shadows were back. This time, closer. The feeling wouldn't leave me that the shadows were closing in. At first, they were just those fleeting glimpses out of the corner of my eye, easy to disregard should I try hard enough. The more I tried to simply ignore them, however, the closer they seemed to come. Every time I turned around, expecting to catch something, would find nothing, just an empty hallway or darkened corner. It was only growing tension, gnawing its way from inside of me. I felt that something was wrong. It wasn't just the missed conversations, forgotten meetings, and strange looks from my coworkers anymore. Something greater was going on, something darker, around me, and right in the middle of it was me, whether I wanted to be or not. I tried to distract myself with work. That had always been my escape. My editor, Richard, was already on my back about missing deadlines, and I couldn't afford to slip any further behind. I dove headfirst into the research, hammering away on the keyboard, forcing myself to pay attention. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to the stairs. Those damned stairs. When lunch finally came around, I just couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something in order to clear my head. So I did what I have always done: running. I laced my shoes, headed out the door, and promised myself I was staying away from the stairs. But as soon as my feet hit the pavement, my body seemed to have another plan altogether. I could feel the pull, subtle but undeniable, pulling me back toward the old building. Before I knew it, I stood before them once again. Older, worn, and slightly out of place, they were exactly as I had left them. Yet this time, the air seemed to hang thickly about them, heavy with a weight that leaned upon my shoulders. I stopped, and my breath abruptly caught in my throat. What was I doing? Why was I here again? I wanted to turn and walk away. Literally, the rational part of my brain was screaming to turn around, to run in the opposite direction. Yet my feet wouldn't budge. I stood there, staring up at the stairs, that same strange chill creeping up my spine. Then, before I knew it, or could understand what I was doing, I was climbing those stairs again. Every step felt heavier, more labored. By the time I reached the top, I was dripping with sweat, even though the air was cool. The door at the top of the stairs was still there, slightly ajar, just like before. I told myself I wouldn't go inside. I'd just look. Just one more glance, and I'd leave. But something inside me, something I couldn't explain, pushed me forward. The world moved again as I stepped through the doorway. The air inside was colder than it had been, dust in the air, thicker. The windows were cracked, filtering in shafts of light across the floor. The room was empty, silent. Yet I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, something watching me. The skin prickled with that feeling, as cold sweat broke out across the body. I turned slowly, scanning the room, but nothing looked out of place. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I saw it again, just for a second, out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It flickered in the far corner of the room, there and gone in an instant. My heart skipped a beat. Hello? My voice echoed strangely in the empty space, making me feel even more alone. No response. I took another step closer to the corner, my heart racing, my breathing shallow. The closer I got, the colder the air became. But when I reached the corner, there was nothing there. Just shadows, and dust, and silence. I backed away, the feeling of dread wrapping tighter around me like a suffocating blanket. I needed to leave. Now. I turned and practically ran out of the room, my footsteps loud against the old wooden floors. I went down the stairs with this feeling that someone was behind me, right behind me, watching my moves. The crawling of my skin resulted in the hair at the back of my neck standing up. By the time I hit the sidewalk, I wasn't breathing. My heart was pounding in my chest. I spun around, expecting to see someone, anybody, after me. But the street was empty. The park was still. Everything seemed normal. But it wasn't. I walked back to my apartment trying to shake the feeling, but it remained with me, like some shadow from which I couldn't run. That night, lying in bed, I kept hearing things, small noises, creaks, the kind of sounds one hears in old buildings. But this was different. The sounds weren't random. They felt deliberate. Like someone was moving around in my apartment. I rose to my feet and paced my room, double-checking my door and window locks. They were all fine, but that did little to stop a sense of something amiss from creeping over me. Moving to the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, then stood in the poor light, taking deep breaths. And then I heard it, a soft, unmistakable whisper. "Jake." I froze. My blood ran cold. It wasn't loud, but the voice was clear. Someone or something was calling my name. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there wasn't anyone. Just the dark, empty apartment. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed up against the counter, my mind racing. I knew I heard it. I wasn't hearing things. Jake. It spoke again, quieter this time, closer. I sprinted to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Sat on the edge of the bed, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands shaking. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. The stairs, the shadow, the missing conversation, something was happening to me, and I didn't know how to stop it. The rest of the night was a kind of paranoid blur of terrors, every creak, every shadow seemed a threat. I lay awake. I couldn't focus on anything except the feeling that something was waiting for me, watching me, just out of sight. The moment the morning came, I had made my mind up. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this on edge, scared of my own shadow. I was going back to those stairs. Whatever was happening to me had started there, and I was going to find out why. I didn't know what I was walking into, but at this point, I didn't care. I had to know. The next morning, I had woken with one resolution in mind: I needed to go back. Conceitedly, it had terrified me, but something felt pulled toward those stairs, like they held the answer to everything that was going on around me. Missing conversations, shadows, whispering, I knew none of it was a coincidence. I had skipped my jog, barely touched my coffee, and somehow was walking the familiar route toward the building. The city was strangely distant as I moved through the streets, like everything around me was dulled somehow, muted. I wasn't sure whether it was my mind playing tricks or if something was shifted since I'd last been to the stairs. The air weighted already, like a weight pressed down upon me, and it could be perceived even while only approaching the building. There they were, just as I remembered them, worn, cracked, waiting. This time, though, the door at the top was slightly more ajar, as if it had been expecting me. I hesitated a moment. Every fiber of my body screamed at me to turn and run, to forget the stairs and shadowy outlines and try to return to my old life. But I knew I couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. I ran up the stairs, my heart beat louder with every step. At the top, I pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. Its hinges protested loudly. The room was just like I remembered it, empty, silent, full of dust. This time, however, I was not alone. In the far corner stood a figure. It wasn't moving, just watching. My breath got caught in my throat. That shadow I had seen before was no longer some fleeting glimpse. It was real. And it was there, standing in the dim light. For a few moments, we simply stood there staring at each other. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend exactly what it was that I was seeing, but there was no sense to this. The figure wasn't human, at least, not anymore. Its form was dark, undefined, yet having an unmistakable presence. My legs were shaking, and I couldn't move. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It didn't speak. It merely stood there, its head cocked to one side, almost as if it were considering me. My heart was pounding in my throat as a wave of fear ran wild in my veins. I instinctively took one backward step toward the door, expecting at any moment to make a run for it, but something inside just froze. And then, in a voice so soft and quiet that I wasn't even sure I'd heard it, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." These words were a shot of ice-cold water into my bones. Frozen by fear, I wanted to run, but my feet seemed stuck to the floor. My brain screamed at me to flee, but my body could not move. I felt trapped, held by some unseen force. I need answers," I said with a shake in my voice. "What's happening to me? Why are you following me?" The figure cocked its head to one side once more, the dark form blurred for a moment, and in that instant, I might have sworn I saw the merest flicker of something human in its movements. Just that, and then it was gone. "Once you see them," it whispered, "you can't unsee them." I didn't know what that meant, but somehow the gravity of those words hung heavy in the air. I was chilled to the bone, my head racing with confusion and fear. I could not stay here any longer, I had to get out. I turned and ran down the staircase, my heart thudding in my chest, without waiting to hear another word. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath. I turned back to look at the building, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but the stairs were empty. The door was closed. Back in my apartment, safely locked behind the door, I tried to wrap my brain around what just happened. What was that, a human or beast? And what did "you can't unsee them" mean? All my thoughts ran and circled, round and round. However hard I tried to shake that shadowy figure off from my mind, it just would not go. I needed help. But to whom was I to turn? Who would believe me? If I went to Sarah, she'd probably think I'd lost my mind. Richard would tell me to take a vacation. No one would understand. And that's when it hit me. The figure, it hadn't felt like a threat. It was warning me. Something far worse was coming. The figure's words echoed in my mind all day long. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. What had I seen? What had I brought into my life just by climbing those stairs? I sat in my apartment trying to distract myself, but every shadow in the room seemed to move if I wasn't looking. Every noise, every creak was something creeping closer. I fumbled for my phone and considered calling Sarah. What was I to say, though? That I saw shadows that weren't there? That I talked to something that shouldn't exist? She already thought I was insane after the forgotten conversations. This would further ostracize me. I spent the next hours pacing my apartment, my nerves on edge, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights outside cast eerie shapes against my walls. I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was coming. I had to do something. Anything. Taking my coat, I left the apartment and headed toward what was, for me at least, a good candidate for finding the answers, the library. Well, it wasn't much of a plan, but doing some research on strange, unexplained events was the only thing I could think of. Maybe I might find something, some urban legend or story that could help me make some sense out of my experiences. The library was nearly empty when I finally arrived, which suited me just fine. The fewer people, the better. I went to the back to the section where they kept old records of the city newspapers, local legends, that sort of thing. I figured if these stairs had been around as long as they seemed to be, there'd be something about them in the archives. I read dusty newspaper clippings and scrolled through ancient records for hours on end. There were stories about the building, how it had been abandoned for years due to a failed renovation, how people came and went. Yet, nothing of the stairs. It was as though they didn't exist in the records at all, right there in plain sight. I sat back, frustrated, rubbing my eyes. It didn't make sense. How could something so obvious, something so present, be invisible to history? Then I found something mentioned, buried in a pile of articles. It wasn't much, just a short note about some disappearances that had taken place around the park decades ago. People had vanished, but there had been nothing to find, no bodies, no leads, nothing at all. Some of the disappearances had been written off as runaways, others as accidents, but the tone of the article insinuated that there was more to it. And weirdest of all these disappearances had happened within the same radius, just blocks away from this building, with the stairs. My stomach dropped. Could it be connected? Could these stairs have something to do with those disappearances? The lights in the library suddenly flickered and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked around half expecting to see one of those shadowy figures lurking up and down the aisles, but there was nothing. Still, I didn't get the feeling I was alone. Not entirely. I gathered my things and left, the discomfort in the air following me out into the night. The streets were quieter than usual as I made my way back to my apartment, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should, and the shadows on the buildings felt deeper, more threatening. When I got home, I was exhausted, but my mind refused to shut down. The pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit together. How were the stairs, the figure, the disappearances connected? Was I going crazy, or was this something huge? I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. But the whispering started again. It started as a soft whisper, like the wind through the cracks in the wall, then grew louder, clearer. Jake. I sat up abruptly in bed, my heart racing, for the voice was so near, someone practically standing beside me. I looked around at the darkness of the room, but nobody was there. Still, the voice continued. Jake, you can't hide from them. My hands shook as I slung the covers off and stood. I turned on all the lights, my chest clenched in fear. I could feel them. The shadows. The figures. They watched me. They waited. I reached for my phone, opening Sarah's contact. My thumb made a triangle over the call button. I needed to speak with anyone. But as I stood there, my hand froze. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. Maybe that was it. Maybe I wasn't supposed to involve anyone else. Maybe the moment I climbed those stairs, I became part of something that couldn't be undone, something I had to face alone. I put the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't keep running from it. Whatever these shadows were, whatever this presence was that entered my life, I had to face it. The shadows were closing in. And I needed to know why. The next morning was different. It wasn't just the lack of sleep that made the city feel quieter than it usually was. The tugging went a lot deeper. Some kind of invisible string was tugging me back to the stairs. I tried to fight it, but by the time I'd finished my coffee and put on my jacket, I knew there was no avoiding it. I had to go back. Whatever was happening, whatever these shadows were, it had all started there. I couldn't move forward without confronting them again. I walked up to the building, noticing that the streets were far emptier than they usually were on the morning of a lecture. It was one of those really crisp mornings, the sun low on the horizon casting long shadows down the pavement. I tried to avoid looking at them. They reminded me too much of what had been lurking in my apartment, whispering my name in the dark. The staircase was still waiting when I came to the building, and I merely paused at the bottom and looked up the worn steps. The door was still standing part way open at the top, just as when I'd last come here. Yet I had no doubt this time, something was waiting for me inside. I took a deep breath, starting my rise upward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if even the air was against me. The closer to the top that I got, the more the world seemed to close in around me. By the time I reached the door, my heart was pounding in my chest, but I wasn't turning back. I pushed open the door, half expecting the figure to be standing there, watching me. But it was an empty room. Just as it had been before, dust hung in the air, the light filtering through cracked windows and casting eerie shadows on the floor. But something was different this time. I couldn't put my finger on it, at first, then I saw it, the corner of the room where the figure had stood. The shadows there were darker, deeper than the rest of the room, like they didn't belong. I took one step closer to them and then another, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Every instinct yelled at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something tugged at my waist, dragging me closer to that dark corner. As I drew closer, the air seemed to grow colder. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped a few feet away from the shadows and stared into the darkness. Then, the shadows began to stir. A figure materialized, just as it had before, but it was not silent this time. Its shape was ill-defined, vague in outline, yet its presence was unmistakable. I could sense it, an overwhelming surge of fear washing over me as it moved. "You've come back," it hissed, the voice resounding within the deserted room. I wished to speak, to ask it who or what it was, but my throat was dry, and words would not come. I was frozen in place, where I had been when the figure had stepped closer. "You shouldn't have come back," it said again, its voice little more than a whisper. "I need answers," I finally managed to say, voice shaking. "What are you? What's happening to me?" This figure paused no more than a few feet away from me, in such poor light, its form blurred. It was impossible to say where shadows stopped and form began, but I felt its presence settle upon me like some cold, dead weight. "They are watching," it whispered, voice soft, chilling. "You've seen them now. And once you see them..." The words died on his lips, and the room was silent. My heart turned over in my chest, and my head spun. What did it mean? Who had been watching me? The shadows? The figures I kept seeing? I moved backward, my breath catching in my throat. Who are they? The figure cocked his head to one side, and his form trembled with the poor light. They are always there. Watching. Waiting. A chill ran down my spine. The words of this figure made no sense, and yet that was what was terrifyingly real. The shadows, voices, strange happenings, it connected, and yet I did not know how. It became impossible for me to stay in there any longer. My body seemed to scream at me to get out, to run, and not to be late. I said nothing more and, turning, ran to the door. My footsteps echoed in that empty building. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath. Behind me, the building loomed, silent and dark, but I could still feel the presence of shadows, lingering just out of sight. Back in the safety of my apartment, I tried to calm down, but my mind wouldn't race to stop. The figure's words replayed over and over in my head, "They are watching." Whom did she mean by they? And why were they watching me? I knew I couldn't stay away from the shadows forever. They had seeped into my life, oozing into reality as some sort of dark stain. The worst part? I felt them close even then, as I sat in the light of my apartment. I didn't have much time. Whatever it was the shadows wanted, they were going to take it very soon. I needed a way of stopping them before it could get too late. But deep inside, I had an awful feeling. The moment I began climbing those stairs, I had sealed my fate. The days blurred by after that. The shadows didn't go away, really. They just sort of lingered, hanging at the edges of my vision, always there, yet never truly showing themselves. I couldn't sleep. I could hardly focus. Every noise, every shift in light, seemed to be them, moving closer, just waiting for the opportune moment to finally reveal themselves completely. I needed to be out of my apartment. The walls were closing in, the air thick with the weight of whatever was following me. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I snatched up my coat, my keys, and headed for the door, hoping some fresh air would clear my head, help me think. Coming out into the world, it just felt different. The city wasn't its usual bustling self, the streets were quieter, the colors duller, and everything felt quite out of place. People moved around me, but they felt out of reach, as though they weren't there. I kept my gaze fixed on the sidewalk, doing my best to avoid the shadows stretching in ways that didn't feel quite natural across the pavement. I didn't even really know which direction I was walking. My legs just kind of took me, and soon enough, I was back at the park. The one place that at one time had brought me peace was now the one place that could fill me with dread. I knew the building with the stairs in it was nearby. I hadn't meant to come back here, but it was as if something had guided me here, pulled me back toward the source of all of this. I stood at the edge of the park and thought about turning around, marching back home. I knew the stairs were a bad idea, not after what happened last time. But something in me, deeper than all reason, insisted I forge ahead. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe desperation. Maybe the shadows themselves, calling me back toward them. I resumed walking, my feet carrying me forward well before conscious thought was making decisions to move. The building came into view, its decaying walls slung out in a flourish of long shadows through the late afternoon light. The stairs were there, waiting always. I could no longer avoid them. I went up the stairs at a snail's pace, my feet growing heavier with each rise. At the top, my heart was racing in my chest, and that feeling of dread washed over me all over again. The door was open, just like it was every other time. I reached out and let my hand rest upon the doorknob. Then I heard a soft whisper from inside the room. My name. Jake. I froze. The voice was soft, almost fragile, but unmistakable. It was the same voice I'd heard in my apartment, the one that had called to me in the dark. My pulse quickened, and despite every instinct screaming turn and run, I pushed the door open. It was a dark room, even darker than it would have appeared. It seemed as though the shadows had come alive on the walls, to writhe in the dim light. I stepped inside, my breathing coming in shallow gasps. The air was colder than it had ever been before, almost freezing. And then I saw it. No longer a shadow, it stood in the middle of the room. It was dark now and imposing, filling the entire space in the room. Its face, or what passed for its face, was shrouded in shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me. "You've seen them," the voice said, barely louder than a whisper. "You can't escape now." I swallowed hard as I froze. "What do you want from me?" The figure did not move. It was as if the shadows around it released a ripple, as if even the air shifted. "They are here. They have always been here. And now, they want you." My heart was racing. "Who are they?" The figure didn't answer immediately but took another step closer, its form solidifying, growing more real. I could see the outline of its hands now long and slender, almost human but not quite. "They watch," it whispered. "They wait. They take." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was something far worse than I had imagined. The shadows, the figures, they weren't just haunting me. They were waiting for something. And now they were ready to take it. "I don't understand," I stammered, stepping back toward the door. "What do they want from me?" The face of the figure, rather where its face should be, shifted a little, as if it would smile. The air chilled more, and the shadows around it pulsed as though they themselves were alive with some dark energy. "They want you," it whispered. "You've seen them. You've opened the door. And now, they will take you." I stepped back, the beating of my heart in my chest. I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt heavy, refusing to move the body. The figure took another step closer and the shadows around it snaked toward me. "They have been watching," he continued. "For years, they have watched. You are not the first. And you are not the last." At last, my legs took matters into their own control, and I was running to the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I ran right out of the building and halfway up the street, not stopping until I was outside and in broad daylight. My lungs were on fire, my body shaking with fear, but I didn't turn around. I threw myself into the apartment, slamming shut the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it. The shadows of the room were darker than usual, longer. Something was here. It watched. It waited. Now it was closer than ever. The moment I had locked the door behind my back, it felt at once more that weight in the air. The shadows in my apartment seemed heavier than before, thicker, living, pulsing with something invisible to me. I sat down at my kitchen table, shaking my hands, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't help but feel that something was going to happen, that the shadows in the room were closing in. I reached for my phone and stared at Sarah's contact, my finger poised over the call button. She was the only person I trusted, but how could I explain any of this to her without sounding insane? The forgotten conversations, the strange occurrences, the shadows that followed me everywhere, it was too much. She'd never believe me. But I needed to talk to someone. I needed to hear a familiar voice, something that would ground me in reality. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the call button. After 2 rings, the phone was answered by Sarah. "Hey, Jake," she said brightly, like everything in the world was okay. "What's up?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Hey, I just needed to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her frown. "You okay? You sound off." I ran a hand through my hair, glancing at the darkened corners of my apartment. The shadows felt closer, more oppressive. "I don't know. Things have been weird lately. Like, really weird." Sarah let out a soft laugh, but it lacked her usual warmth. "Weird how? You mean work, or?" "No," I said quickly, "not work. It's something else. There's something following me. I know it sounds crazy, but I keep seeing these shadows, these figures. And they're getting closer." Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Jake, are you sure you're not just exhausted? I mean, we've been under a lot of pressure lately with deadlines and—" "It's not just exhaustion," I interrupted, my tone a bit too sharp. "It's real, Sarah. I have seen them. They're watching me. And I don't know what they want, but they're not going away." Silence on the other end. My heart pounded in my chest while I waited for her to say something, anything. But when she finally spoke, it wasn't what I expected. "You've been acting weird, Jake. Since last week. You're forgetting things, saying things that don't make sense. I'm worried about you." I blinked, my mind all confusion. "What are you talking about? That article you said you finished it was never turned in. You asked about meetings we never had. And now this? You're scaring me." My stomach just about hit the floor. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I wasn't forgetting things, that it wasn't all in my head. But with a pang, I knew I couldn't be so sure anymore. My memories felt disjointed, like pieces of a dream I couldn't quite catch. "I'm not making this up," I whispered, so barely audible. "I know what I've seen." Sarah sighed. "Jake, maybe you should take a break. Get some rest. Clear your head. Whatever's going on. I don't think it's real." These words hit me like a punch in the solar plexus. She didn't believe me. I was on my own. I hung up without a goodbye and stared down at my phone, a sinking feeling in my chest. I had hoped that talking to Sarah might make things better, but now I just felt more alone than ever. I stood, pacing the room, my mind racing. The shadows in the corners loomed larger, shifting and twisting in ways that made my skin crawl. I knew that I couldn't stay here, not them watching me, not them so close. I snatched up my jacket and lurched toward the door. I had no idea what direction I was going, where, but I had to get out of this apartment. I couldn't breathe in there, or think. Maybe if I walked, if I just kept moving, I could outrun them. For a little while, at least. The streets were creepily silent as I stepped out into the pale glow of streetlights bathing the city. It was late, much later than what I had imagined, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away. I walked for hours, it seemed, the chill of the night air nibbling at my skin. Yet no matter how far I went, the sensation of being watched would not leave me. The shadows cast down the alleyways by each building follow along the ground, like fingers reaching out to snatch me. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see one of these figures standing there, waiting. But the streets were deserted. Still, I knew they were there. Always watching. Somehow, I found myself back near the park, the familiar sight of the old building looming ahead. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't meant to come here, but somehow, my feet had carried me back. I stared up at the building, the shadows dancing across the crumbling facade. The stairs were there, waiting for me like they always did. I knew I shouldn't go back. I knew whatever I was dealing with had something to do with those stairs. But I couldn't help myself. Something about them was pulling me in, drawing me closer like a moth to a flame. Without thinking, I started walking towards them. My breath quickened as I climbed the steps, weighted down by the heavy air. The open door at the top was inviting, wider than it had been before. I stepped inside as familiar chill washed over me. Darker than ever, the room seemed to be swaddled in shadows thick with life, watching and waiting. I wasn't alone. I had felt it the moment I stepped into the room, the cold, the weight, the presence. It was as if the shadows were alive and moved of their own accord, as if they somehow knew I had entered. I caught my breath in my throat and stepped forward cautiously a few feet, peering to see through the darkness. But this time it wasn't a feeling. I knew they were there, watching, waiting. I could feel their gaze, a palpable thing, the weight of a hand on my shoulder. The weight of the air was thick, almost crushing, and I found myself reminding my body to breathe, to calm down. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, the shadows started to shift. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, its form vague and undefined but unmistakably there. Instantly, my heart went into overdrive and every instinct inside of me screamed to run like crazy. Yet my body was paralyzed, standing there fixed on that figure. "You came back," the whispering voice echoed through the vacant room. It was the same voice that had haunted me for days, but now, it was louder and more distinct. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I didn't have a choice," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what's happening to me." The figure didn't budge, but the presence coming off it seemed to ramp up, like an invisible weight squishing down harder and harder. The shadows around it pulsed and danced, almost alive in their own right, feeding on the air thick with tension. "You've seen them," it said again. "Now, they see you." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Who are they? What do they want?" For a minute, the figure didn't say anything. The darkness seemed to swirl around it as if it were alive. Then it spoke again, in that soft, cold voice. "They've been watching. Always watching. But once you noticed them, once you saw them, you opened a door." I took another step back. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears. "What do you mean? What door?" In the poor light, the figure's head tilted slightly, weighing my question. "The world you know isn't the only one. There are other shadows of our reality, layers that most people never see. But you saw them. And now they're coming for you." My mind whirled, trying to make some sort of sense of the figure's words. Shades of reality, layers of existence, it was impossible, the stuff of nightmares. Yet, in that deep place, I knew it was so. I knew it since that first time I climbed those stairs, into a world shifted and morphed shadows, now more than shades of light. "How do I stop it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do I close the door?" The figure's form seemed to ripple, its edges bleeding into the darkness. "You can't. Once the door is open, it cannot be closed. You've crossed into their world now." I took a step backward, panic rising in my chest. "There has to be a way. I didn't ask for this. I didn't mean to." "They don't care what you meant," the figure cut in, its voice now colder. "You saw them. That is enough." I felt the room closing in on me now, the wall strained toward me through a whirl of shifting shadows at the edges of my vision. I'd like to run, to flee, but I knew there was no running from this. Whatever had been set in motion, it couldn't be undone. "They will take you," he said quietly, his voice no louder than a whisper. "And when they do, you will become one of them. A shadow." My stomach twisted at the thought, a deep sense of dread settling over me. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that this was my fate. But the weight of the figure's words was impossible to ignore. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice small. "Why me?" Again, the figure's head tipped, like it considered me. "They don't want you. They want what you have seen. What you now know." I had no idea what that was supposed to mean, and before I could ask, the shadows prancing around the figure began to pulse and shudder, darkening and becoming far more turbulent. The air grew colder, the room felt as though it were being consumed by the darkness itself. "They are coming," the figure said. "And when they arrive, you will be taken." My body went rigid, fear coursed through my veins. "Neen," I whispered, more to myself than to the figure. "Neen, I won't let that happen. You have no choice." The figure began to dissolve into the shadows, his form melting back into the darkness from which he had come. I wanted to scream to demand more answers, but my voice failed me. The room was closing in, the shadows thickening, pressing down on me from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded. It was gone. The room was silent again, except for the sound of my labored breathing. But what it had said hung in the air, thick and oppressive. I was not alone. Not anymore. I pivoted and ran from the room, my footsteps incredibly loud in the silence. The moment I was outside, it was as though the weight had been lifted from my chest, the night air cool, hitting me like a slap in the face. I gasped for breath and struggled to steady myself, leaning against the wall of the building. But even out here, I could feel them, the shadows watching, waiting. I knew now that there was no escape. The door had been opened, and I was part of their world now. The shadows weren't just haunting me, they were claiming me. Slowly, piece by piece. And soon, they would take everything. The night's cold air did little to take the fogginess from my brain. My heart was still racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wall outside the building. Ringing in my head were the figure's words, "They are coming. You will be taken." Reality was setting in, the weight crushing me. The shadows came alive, no longer watching me but claiming me. I could feel it in the air, the darkness that followed me seemed to stretch towards me like something alive. I pushed off from the wall and started walking, my legs trembling, unsteady. I didn't know what direction I was walking, only that I couldn't stand near that building a second longer. I needed to think, to figure out whether there was any way whatsoever to stop this. But deep inside, I knew the truth. There was no way to stop this thing. I had seen them, and now they wouldn't rest until they had me. The streets were nearly empty as I walked, the occasional car passing by, but everything felt so distant, so disconnected. The city around me was different now, like an empty shell of a place I once knew. The shadows clung to the edges of every building, every streetlight, watching, waiting. They weren't just following me, they were everywhere. I walked, the phone suddenly buzzing in my pocket. I tugged it out, half expecting to see a message from Sarah, but it wasn't her. It was an unknown number. "You can't run from them. You know that." I had been staring at the message. I didn't know from whom it was, and neither did I need to. The shadows just didn't stay with stalking me physically, they were inside every part of my life now, on my head, on my phone, in my existence. I continued to walk, the thoughts swimming in my head. There was something I could do. A way I could fight. With each step, though, I felt the pull of the shadows getting stronger, as if they were somehow drawing me to something, guiding me toward the inevitable. Before I knew it, I was standing at the entrance of the park. My stomach twisted. This was definitely not where I had intended to go, yet here I was once again, as if something had pulled me back. The shadows thickened around the entrance and almost seemed to call me inside. I hesitated, frozen in place as my feet seemed to lock themselves right where they were. Every sane part of my mind screamed to turn around, to run as far away as I could. But I knew it wouldn't matter, I couldn't outrun them, they were part of me now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the park. The darkness seemed to close in almost immediately. It was as if the trees grew taller, looming over me with their gnarled branches twisting and curling in unnatural directions. I could hardly see the way ahead of me anymore because it was swallowed by the encroaching shadows. I just continued onward, my body acting of its own volition, as if I had no choice but to follow where the shadows led me. With every step, it seemed, the air grew thick with weight. It was as if the world were bearing down on me, compressing my chest, making breathing more difficult. Then I saw them ahead of me. The stairs. They stood there, as they always had, old and cracked, leading up to that door, the one that had started it all. Still, something was different this time. The shadows around the stairs seemed thicker and darker, almost solid. They pulsed and shifted, as if alive, waiting for me. I knew this was at the final step. I went up the stairs with trembling hands, my breath's shallow quick gasps. The door at the top was wide open now, darkness spewing out from inside as if it were a black fog. I could feel the pull stronger than ever dragging me forward. As I stepped inside, the world shifted again. Freezing air, the swirling shadows around me like a living thing. The room stood empty, but I felt them here. They were. All of them. I stood in the middle of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. There was no escape. I knew that from the outset. The shadows had claimed me, and now, there was nothing left but to let them take me. Then, I heard it. The voice. The same voice that whispered to me in the dark, that haunted my every step. Jake. Slowly, I turned around, and my body went numb with fear. There it was, the figure stood in the dark, watching me. This time, however, there was more. Dozens of figures, their forms shifting and twisting in the dark, their eyes locked on me. You opened the door, the voice whispered. Now you belong to them. I swallowed hard, my legs were quivering. The chill was closing in, the darkness weighing upon my chest. My sight blurred, and I felt the shadows closing in, inching their way nearer until I could see the shapes of things, misshapen, bulging. I wanted to scream, run, fight back, but my body refused to budge. It enveloped me, the cold, suffocating shadows pulling me down, pulling me into them. And in that millisecond, before the blackness took me, I knew the truth. I had never left. From the moment I had climbed those stairs, I had been theirs. Part of their world, trapped in the dark. And now, I was one of them.